Hello, I'm Benjamin Kennedy, and welcome to a compilation of videos that I took as tests for the Gamaeyong All Monsters Counterattack costume. The first video that you'll be seeing here is of me trying the costume directly after it was latexed and sealed. We used custom, what would be called leather red paint that was mixed into bare premium indoor latex-based paint. We stirred some of that into the sealant. Not the sealant. We stirred it into the latex. So that way we could get a grasp on where we had been as we painted the latex onto the costume. And we were able to keep track of, where we had been. And then we were able to just move much faster. And the reason you want to do that is because latex on its own just dries into a normal beige color. And the beige color, unfortunately, kind of just blends into the foam color. They're basically the same color. So if you just brush latex on raw, it's very hard to tell what parts of the costume you've latexed and what parts you haven't. And as a result, you can get too much buildup of latex in some areas and too little in others. But when you add some paint into the latex, it really allows you to see much easier what parts of the foam are covered and what parts are not. Part of the test, of course, was to see how the costume moved on screen and to start establishing what kind of character the costume could display that would match the facial expression. If the movements and the facial expression don't combine well enough, then the costume will be essentially useless because you won't be able to get the proper characterization across. So in the end, your movements tend to be dictated by the costume itself and not necessarily what you would want to do inside of it. There's a certain amount you can decide, but you tend to find that the costume kind of naturally directs you as to how to portray the character of the monster. So it's not hard, actually. When you describe it in intellectual terms, it sounds like something rather difficult and a huge intellectual exercise, but it's actually not. It's fairly intuitive. You just get inside and move around, and before you know it, you kind of know how the costume is directing you to move. Technically, a lot of the tests where I'm actually inside of the costume moving around was to test to see what I thought of shooting at normal 24 frames per second as opposed to shooting 60 frames per second and then slowing it down. The first two Gamaeyongs, I slowed the footage down after shooting 60 frames per second, which is the established way of shooting a giant monster movie as like this. Although in the old days, technically they filmed 3 times regular speed, which would be about 72 frames per second. If you watch the behind the scenes for some of the newer Godzillas, you'll see when they show the monitor that they'll be filming at anywhere between 30 to 60 to 72. Sometimes they only shoot at 48 frames per second and slow it down. It all depends on what kind of movement is being done and what is a reasonable speed to ask the actor to move at in order to accomplish what needs to be done. And be able to slow it down to where all the explosions and pyrotechnics and stuff will also look natural. In this case, I never have had to worry about having to match the speed of the pyrotechnics and stuff like that because it's all stock footage. So the stock footage itself you can slow down or speed up based on what is needed for the shot individually. So you don't actually have to worry about those things. So all I was concerned with was the total performance. And for the first two, I wanted to do the more traditional method of, shooting and performing faster and slowing it down. But I never really felt fully satisfied that I had nailed the character shooting like that. You always end up just watching it and end up relieved if it looks okay. But if you shoot 24 frames per second, the interesting thing about it is like you can actually slow your movements down, especially when you're buried in a foam monster costume, to look, make yourself look bigger and heavier. But when you're actually moving at a pace you decide, and it's all being captured as is, instead of having to guess what the end result will be, you kind of feel like you're actually nailing the character more as you're filming. So I wanted to do 24 frames per second for the third one. And that was because when I looked at a lot of the movies that really kind of I found charming in the Godzilla series, I was always drawn to a lot of the 70s Godzilla movies where they actually did just film normal speed. And I always actually found those shots more charming in a lot of ways. I think it connects you more directly with the performance instead of awe of the illusion. With shooting rapidly and then slowing it down, the awe comes from the illusion that something appears to actually be a giant, slow-moving creature. But with 24 frames per second, or even just, shooting any frame rate and then leaving it as is, it just gives you a direct connection with the performance, which I think gives you, therefore, more connection to the actual human being. I found that more interesting, and I was finding it way more interesting than slowed down footage at the time I filmed. So I wanted to see if that would work for me, and I was happy with all the results that I got, when I was testing with me inside the costume, acting it out. So the whole movie of All Monsters Counterattack Directive is actually just 24 frames per second, presented as is for the most part. There's only one scene that's slowed down at the very beginning of the movie. And you can tell because there's a couple of jerks at the very beginning of the sequence when Gamaeyong is being introduced on the Snake Island. The shot was simply just a little too quick for the pacing I wanted, so I slowed it down just a tad. And that's where shooting 30 frames per second or 60 frames per second can be handier, because even just shooting 30, if you use a 30 frames per second project, you can slow it down to a certain extent and not have any sort of the movement hiccups that slowing 24 frame per second footage will, because with 24 frames per second, some of the movement gets lost in motion blur, whereas 30 frames and 60 frames, it tends that the camera will capture very clearly, most of the movement, unless you're moving very, very quickly. But that can also be helped with the shutter speed of the camera and stuff like that. But me particularly, I wanted to keep the charm of the speed of film that is traditionally showed at or projected at. I wanted to keep that more old-timey theatrical quality, so I chose 24 frames per second. And that can lead to certain glitches and stuff on the technical aspect too, because when you export it to YouTube and stuff, you kind of have to know how to keep the footage preserved, because certain things like, some noise in the image and stuff like that, it'll actually be harder for YouTube to denoise it and actually make it look good if you don't know how to keep it preserved from the edit to export. And so that's all things you kind of learn on the fly as you're going along and trying to do it. But it was worth it for me to go through the hassle to get the atmosphere I wanted. And 24 frames per second really set the atmosphere. Some of the tests that you'll see where I'm not in the costume and I'm not moving around, where it's just the costume hanging up and the set pieces surrounding it and stuff, it's all to see what kind of setups I could do with the costume, how I could surround the costume and leave space for me to move, and put the shots together basically. You can't see it here, but once I got it into the computer, I would test different backgrounds, and some of them would be real backgrounds and some of them would be painted backgrounds. And the test was like, how what methodology of making backgrounds is going to be most coherent with the set pieces. Because obviously it's easier to just go and take a snapshot of the sky and maybe modify it to look like night or something like that, as opposed to painting it from scratch. But I found that real backgrounds were nice, but they didn't really give fully the aesthetic that of like what I wanted, which was like an old 60s television show, like Bewitched or something like that. When you see the sets and stuff like that, I found that painting the background made that atmosphere work better. So I chose to use painted backgrounds. They were painted digitally, though. They weren't real paintings. They were digital paintings that I did in Clip Studio, and they were done with an airbrush. And I used the airbrush because it was much quicker than using either the ink brush or the watercolor brush. Ideally, you'd want to use the watercolor brush because it would add some sort of a painting texture or something like that. But it's a slower process, and it can take a little more to make it look good. So I found that using the airbrush tool was the most efficient way to get it done. And it matches the classic tokusatsu methods too, because they also airbrush the backgrounds when there is a real background. Another thing about the test where the costume was just hanging up, as you'll see it progress, a lot of it was to test the paint schemes and to see if the paint schemes matched what I wanted to do. I initially thought that the leather color with white highlights would be the ideal thing. And I thought it looked pretty nice, but it kind of gave a kind of fluffy, gentle appearance to Gamaeyong, where I kind of wanted it to be a little more hard and sinister, even though the costume is still supposed to retain an element of cuteness too. The white, for me, just kind of added too much cuteness. Some of the white did end up staying where it felt appropriate, but most of it ended up replaced with the black that you see in the final movie. It just tied everything together better, and it made him feel more like a volcanic monster. So the paint job on this costume took several months to do. From what I remember, we finished the costume sometime in June as far as the sealing and latexing. It was June or July, and then it took me until around October the 25th to actually finish the paint job. After that, I think it was 1 or 2 more days of practical work on the opening of the costume and making sure the dorsal fins would stay on the costume and all that stuff. But the paint job itself took somewhere around 3 to 4 months. And it was a very intricate type of paint job, and the reason for that was because there's 2 types of red. There's the base leather color, and then on top of that, there's a more primary red that is integrated into the cracks and crevices of the scales themselves, which you had to use a very small brush to accomplish it, and it took a lot of time. And then overall, that is a dusting of the black color, which in many cases also had to be done with a fairly small sized brush. And as you had to be careful not to cover everything up totally with the black, it had to be very lightly dusted. So the whole process was just very time consuming. It's easier when the scales aren't so small as well, but I really gave myself a lot of trouble there. It all ended up good anyway.